At Arizona Desert Shocks, we know a thing or two about off-road racing, and we made getting the most out of your Broncos off-road performance our priority. Our line of true bolt-on suspension upgrades are just the ticket to make your 2021 and up Ford Bronco perform. Designed to fit four-wheel drive Broncos with lift kits up to 4 inches, they're the perfect addition for your 2- or 4-door Bronco. Upgrading those factory control arms with a set of fully adjustable billet control arms from ADS is the first step in building a true off-road suspension for your Bronco. And when we say bolt-on, we mean it. So let me show you just how easy it is. Before starting your install, lift the vehicle off the ground and support it with some jack stands, allowing the rear axle to drop and unload the rear suspension. Although it's not required, to give you a better view with the camera, I'm going to use the lift. To prevent the axle from shifting, install just one control arm at a time. Start by loosely assembling the heim joint along with the jam nut, followed by the 3/8 jam bolts onto your upper and lower control arms. Press both halves of the poly bushing into each control arm. Don't coat the outside of the bushing or the inside of the control arm with any grease. The acetal copolymer bushings were designed to be pressed in dry. Coat only the steel bushing insert with some grease, then press it into the bushing assembly. Adjust the heim joint to the proper length. Factory lower control arm length is 25 3/4 of an inch center to center of the bushing holes. Unless instructed to do so by your lift kit manufacturer, we recommend using this length as a starting point. The heim joint jam nuts need to be torqued to 125 foot-pounds. It's kind of hard to do on the bench, so I'll wait till they're installed on the vehicle. Install the heim joint alignment spacers as shown. Loosen and remove the bolts from the stock lower control arm. Save the bolts and nuts. Now install the billet ADS lower control arm into the factory location. Reuse the factory hardware and torque the bolt used on the same side as the heim joint to the manufacturer's specs. Tighten the bolt used on the bushing side, just hand tight for now. Align the heim joint so it's vertical in the mount and has the same amount of clearance on both sides. Then torque the heim joint jam nut to 125 foot-pounds. Torque the 2 socket head pinch screws in 3 separate steps, starting with 12 foot-pounds, followed by 25 foot-pounds, and then finally 40 foot-pounds. Install the acetal copolymer sliders and torque the bolts to 89 inch-pounds. Repeat the process for the opposite side. Removing the passenger side upper control arm requires that you drop the fuel tank per the manufacturer's recommended procedure in order to gain access to the front bolt on the upper control arm. Installation on the driver's side doesn't require you to drop the fuel tank. Moving to the upper control arms, loosen the nuts, remove the bolts, and then remove the stock upper control arm from its mounts. Install the heim joint and jam nut as well as the copolymer spacers and sleeve to the upper control arms. Then install the heim joint alignment spacers and install your ADS built upper control arm. Reuse the factory bolts and nuts and torque the bolt used on the same side as the heim joint to the manufacturer's specs. Leave the bolt on the bushing side of the control arm hand tight for now. Align the heim joint so it's vertical in the mount and has equal clearance on both sides. Then torque the jam nut to 125 foot-pounds. Torque the 2 socket head pinch screws in 3 separate steps, starting with 12 foot-pounds, followed by 25 foot-pounds, then 40 foot-pounds. Repeat the process for the opposite side, and just like we did with the lower arms, torque the heim joint bolt to 159 foot-pounds and leave the bushing side just hand tight. If you're working on the passenger side control arms, reinstall the fuel tank. Once all 4 control arms have been replaced, lower the vehicle back onto the ground, allowing the suspension to settle under the weight of the vehicle. Don't forget to go back and torque all 4 of the poly bushing pivot bolts to 159 foot-pounds. And that's all there is to installing the rear control arms on your Ford Bronco. Now let's move up front. To replace the front control arms, raise the front tires of the vehicle off the ground and support the frame on jack stands. Next, remove the lug nuts and take the front tire off. Remove the push pin in the inner fender liner that's located just behind the shock tower. This will allow you to fold back the liner for access to the steering shaft bolt. Remove the steering shaft bolt, then push up on the main shaft to separate it from the knuckle. Be sure to prevent the steering wheel from rotating after the knuckle has been removed. Loosen and remove the upper ball joint nut, then remove the upper ball joint from the spindle with a hard hit from a hammer. Now loosen and remove the cross bolt that secures the stock control arm to the frame mounts. Once the cross bolt is out, lift the control arm up and over the shock tower to remove it. Install the steel sleeves onto the ADS control arms just like this. And remember, the copolymer bushings are meant to be installed dry. Now slide the ADS control arm into the chassis. It's easiest to position the assembly above the shock tower and then slide it down into position. Reinstall your cross bolt and nut, but don't torque it quite yet. Install the upper and lower spacers into the uniball as shown. When it's new, the uniball can be very stiff and hard to articulate. This is normal. Use a socket extension or a small pry bar in the lower cavity and gently pry the uniball until the lower spacer aligns with the hole in the spindle. Install the M14 bolt through the uniball and into the spindle. Then install the nut and torque it to 80 foot-pounds. Lightly lubricate the O-ring and install it on the uniball dust cap. Then press the cap firmly onto the control arm. Reinstall the wheel and install the lug nuts. We can now remove the jack stands and lower the Bronco back onto the ground. With the suspension supporting the full weight of the vehicle, torque the upper control arm cross bolt to 122 foot-pounds. Reinstall the knuckle onto the steering shaft, making sure that the steering wheel did not move on you. Then reinstall the steering shaft bolt and torque the bolt to the manufacturer's specs. Now we can move the wheel liner back into place and reinstall the push pin that we removed earlier. Finally, don't forget to torque the lug nuts to the wheel manufacturer's recommended value, and we're done. After installation, the vehicle is going to require a professional alignment. Use the following values as targets for your suspension geometry. And as always, be sure to recheck the torque specs on all the fasteners after the first 50 miles. Don't forget to keep the rest of your suspension up to par by adding a set of direct fit 2.5-inch race shocks for the ultimate in off-road control. ADS also carries adjustable panhard bars, fully adjustable sway bar links, and half-length tie rod ends to complete your suspension overhaul. So whether you're a seasoned off-road enthusiast or just starting out, bolt-on suspension upgrades from ADS are the perfect way to upgrade your Bronco's off-road performance. To learn more about our full line of suspension components and race shocks, visit us at adsshocks.com.